Welcome back, everybody. So, violence and Malazan, yes. Last week, AP from A Critical Dragon actually uploaded a video where he looks at 8 of our preconceptions that we have about Malazan. And one of those preconceptions he addresses on this list is actually violence. And I would say I totally agree with what AP is saying in this video, because his main point about violence is that a lot of the violence in Malazan is not described directly. So we're getting it either through a different POV person that wasn't directly involved in the act of violence, or we're only described the aftermath of the incident. And his conclusion is that this leaves a lot of room for speculation, and that our imagination actually fills in this gap and makes the violence maybe much more impactful than it actually is on the page. And as I say, I totally agree with AP here, because I can see this with myself. When I read Malazan, I'm a very visual reader. I always say I can take a walk into Rajasthan, which sounds wonderful on one hand, but the downside also is when it comes to those violent scenes. And yeah, I have tons of stuff to play with in my mind to fill in the gaps. So on the one hand, I totally agree with AP. But there was one level where this left me strangely dissatisfied, where I was thinking, yeah, this is, yes, this is right. Yes, I agree. Yes. But I was also thinking, this can't be all when it comes to violence. There must be something else. So this video is a bit my attempt to flesh out what this something else is. Now, a lot of this is very subjective. Some might be just a feeling, but I will do my very, very best to somehow put those subjective impressions, experiences, feelings into something that hopefully will resemble coherent thought. Okay, so my first point would be that additionally to what AP is describing, that my experience with Malazan is that it lulls me into some type of complacency. And what I mean by that is that yeah, it's a very long series with thousands and thousands of pages, but most of those pages do not describe anything violent or any battle scenes or anything like that. Instead, we are actually mostly on the march from one point to another. And yeah, we kind of like undergo this mundaneness of, yeah, walking along, cooking meals. Yeah, it's very normal, it's very mundane. And the idea that this is actually taking place in a war zone goes very, very much to the background. And for me as a reader, I actually, over longer periods, totally forgot that this is military fantasy. Until then, something ruptures this, yeah, almost mundane life that we are undergoing as a reader with our characters, and something violent, horrific is happening. And I think what this does is that the impact is so much higher. Because if I was on a battle scene constantly, one more death, one more person skewered on a sword, or one more person beheaded will not impact anymore. No, it doesn't have the same kind like oomph to it than if I have totally normal scenes where people are sitting around a campfire cooking and then something awful happens. But I also think it leads a little bit to us overestimating how much violence actually there is in the books. Now, this is just a feeling, I have to say. I have no statistic evidence for this. So I can't say there are, I don't know, 350,000 something pages in total and 400 incidents of violence. So we have one incident every so often. No? So I can't do that. But overall, I have the feeling, because the individual act of violence is so much more impactful, that it sticks with me longer. And when I think back on a book, what comes to mind first are those violent incidences, much more so than other things that happen in the book. Another thing that happens, I think, and it goes a bit together with what I just described, is scale. Malazan is in many cases a masterclass in how to use scale. This comes to the landscapes Erikson describes, which are vast, horizonless plains or deserts where we find our characters. So there is this endlessness to the landscape we're in. The same goes for the time scale. I don't know, 300,000 millennia of time that is covered. Now it's a number that it's very hard even to imagine, if we can even imagine this. And I think what this does is it brings home the fact that we are just a little blip in the universe, so much more. So I think it's really a very interesting technique that Erikson uses here to make sure that we as humans and our history, our cultures, our behaviors are not necessarily the driving force in this narrative. But this vastness in time and in landscape, I think, is also where despair starts to rise its head. Because when we follow the characters through those landscapes, they undergo sometimes very horrific living conditions. Characters that come to mind are, for example, Felicen, Haboric, and Bodin, when they are in the Otateral mines, or when they're crossing this glass desert. And we can feel the despair of the characters, but we also feel our own despair. We want this situation to end. We want this landscape to end. We want some goal. We want somewhere where we're going. And this is sometimes not materializing, and makes a lot of the books very challenging to read, because, like I said before, now we have this monotonous boredom almost that is described, where we wonder, yeah, what's actually happening? But what is happening, I think, is this inner turmoil, this inner journey that we also have, where we are experiencing this despair of those situations. And I think this makes Malazan at times, of course, a very challenging read. Another thing is that most of the violence that we encounter in Malazan is actually grounded in reality. Malazan is almost an inventory of all the despicable acts that humans have invented to inflict on each other. And this has its drawbacks as well, because it does not afford us any comfort. And we cannot just say, this is just fiction, or this is just a fantasy setting, because we know very well that what is described is still happening on a daily basis on this planet. And what Erikson does is that he basically prevents us from grabbing this pillow of fantasy that we can hug and huddle behind when the going gets tough, and tell ourselves, well, this is not real. So it's not kind of like a story where a dragon kind of like spews fire and a whole city is incinerated, which is horrific, yes, but I can always tell me there are no dragons in the world. This isn't real. No? So don't get upset. It's okay. No, this is just a fantasy story. But the violence in Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, on the other hand, is in a lot of cases just very, very real. And we are not afforded this comfort that we can just distance ourselves as readers by saying, oh, sure, this is just a fantasy story. And I think that makes the going also that little bit more tougher at times. So if some of the challenging and violent behaviors that we encounter in Malazan are rooted in reality, then yeah, what is actually a challenging behavior? And that brings me to the next point, that behavior without context is meaningless. Now, let's take a little excursion into psychology. And what do I actually mean by this when I say that behavior without context is meaningless? So in psychology, we have something that's called the contextualist worldview of behavior analysis. And this was invented by this guy here, Eric Edmondson, who is a psychologist that has written extensively on challenging behaviors. And what it means is that to understand a behavior and to evaluate behavior, we need context. And this context can come from different sources. So we can have social rules regarding what constitutes appropriate behavior. We can have the ability of the person to give a plausible account for their behavior. We can have our beliefs that are held by us or other participants in the situation where the behavior occurs. And then also we have the capacity of the setting to manage any disruption that's caused by the behavior. And I think this is very important. And what Emerson says then, context is essential in giving meaning to any behavior. Behavior can only be defined as challenging in particular contexts. So if we look at Malazan and the violent behaviors that we might encounter in Malazan, we find very often that we have to shift our context. Malazan is very much geared towards challenging our behavior analysis. So we might find that what we have in our own social norms might not apply to the situation we're reading about. Or one of Emerson's points when he says, well, the capacity of the perpetrator to actually convincingly describe his behavior. So this would go, for example, for military actions, where we ask, are those actions justified? No, because yeah, if they save our lives, we're probably inclined to say yes. Of course, we want the army to move in. If the army moves in to occupy another country and we get the POV of those people that are getting invaded, we might not be so happy and so obligingly say, oh yeah, of course that behavior is justified. Or if we look, for example, at the killing of Coltrane, no, we will not classify this as murder because we understand this is an act of mercy. This is the attempt to end suffering. So it depends very much on the context. And of course, those contexts are also culturally and historically defined. And I think Malazan really challenges us to shift our context in how we evaluate and analyze behavior. And this is not always easy to do. This can be very, very challenging, and depending on which of our beliefs are threatened and we're asked to let go of, can also be very distressing. And yeah, there are examples, especially of culturally defined behavior in Malazan, where we probably flinch and say, no, this is too much. This is over the line for me. An example would be the Segole, a culture of basically warriors where, yeah, your status is determined by how many people you can kill and by you killing the ones that are ranked higher than you. So this basically, yeah, justifies murder in a way and culturally justifies murder. Another culturally determined behavior is the hobbling. And a lot of people say this is too gruesome, this is too awful, because we do not want to shift into a culture and a cultural context where a behavior like this can be normal and can be justified. And it's also always up to the reader then, and how far are we actually willing to forgive characters that participate and practice those behaviors. And this brings me to the fact that we most of the time want to be on morally firm ground. We do not want our ideas of what's good and what's evil to shift so easily. And Malazan is refusing this. Malazan is not a narrative where it's clear what is good and what is evil, but depending on the context and how the context might shift, we can find that behaviors that have been introduced to us as evil might not be so evil after all, or vice versa. And again, this is not something that is easy to take on board and can be very challenging for a reader. And there have been many scenes where I was sitting there and thinking to myself, really? This is where we're going with this? No, I do not agree. Also, we might find that good and evil is not just culturally and historically defined, but can also be ripped away very, very easily. The non-fantasy writer, but still I think one of the really important writers, Virginia Woolf, calls this the thin veneer of civilization. And she talks about this in her novel To the Lighthouse, where when we come back from our trip out to the lighthouse, we have a dinner scene. And I think Virginia Woolf does dinner scenes exceptionally well. This is really where, yeah, some of the characters and the kind of like underlying cruelties of characters are coming out as well. And it's the same here, because this is dinner scene. Yeah, it's almost a little bit like a fantastic realism moment in the story, because the dinner scene morphs almost into an orgy, and the participants are, yeah, their meanness, their cruelty, their willingness to be violent to each other and go at each other's throats comes suddenly out and is displayed. But it's just, yeah, almost like a vision more than a reality that we're seeing. And in this context, Virginia Woolf kind of like talks about how easy it is to rip away the thin veneer of civilization. And I think Malazan does this on a much bigger scale, because there are 10 books in total. The books are very big, packed full of different situations, different characters, different cultures. But the books show us over and over again how easy it actually is to get rid of this, yeah, layer of civilization. And it links also into what I was talking about earlier, this idea of scale. And I think this scale that dwarfs us as humans and dwarfs our civilization and our, yeah, what we might want to see at our achievements of civilization, adds again to this idea that this can be ripped away in a moment, no? in a heartbeat, in a blink. No? We blink and our civilization might just be gone. And again, I think this makes the books very, very challenging, but also makes the behaviors that are displayed in the books a bit more challenging than if we would encounter them in a different context. And that brings me to my last point, Malazan as a journey of self-discovery. Now, this will really depend very much on the individual reader and how much a reader is actually willing to go on this journey of self-discovery. Because we might find out that we're not so different than the people that are described in the novels. We might find out that we all have some of that violent streak in us. We might find out that we can be pushed easily into a situation where we will let go of all civilization, where we might let go of our social norms and actually engage in forms of violence. And this is probably the most disturbing aspect of the books, what we might find inside ourselves, because there is nothing darker than the dark corners of our own hearts. Thank you for watching. I'm looking forward to your comments. If you have comments or ideas or other aspects that I haven't mentioned yet, please leave them in the comment section. You might feel compelled even to do your own video. Please do so. Or maybe some Malaz might want to get together and discuss this a little bit more, which I would be welcoming very much as well. So thank you everybody if you're still watching, and I hope to see you in the next Excavating Malazan episode.